where literacy evolves with technology and language proficiency. This is the Multiliterate Mind podcast with Dr. Liza Trejo and Marnina Falk-Coleman.
Hello and welcome to the Multiliterate Mind. I'm Marnina Falk-Coleman and I'm joined by my colleague and co-host, Dr. Liza Trejo.
Hi, Marnina. So glad to be here.
So glad to be back in the studio again. For those that are new listening, together we explore how language proficiency, multiliteracy, and human communication are evolving in a rapidly changing AI-influenced world. Today, we're really excited to welcome two colleagues and longtime collaborators, Paul Spence and Jonathan White. Welcome to the podcast, Paul and Jonathan. We're so excited to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having us.
It's good to be here.
Before we dive in, we want to give listeners a quick sense of who you are, though we know your work so well. Paul, you've spent nearly 2 decades in language education. You've taught everything from Spanish and Latin to immersion and ESL. And today, you serve as the coordinator of international programs in Richland 1, where you oversee bilingual programs across the district. And Jonathan, your path started with Russian language and literature, and over the last 20 plus years, you've worked with multilingual learners across nearly every grade level. As a sheltered ELA and biology teacher, an ESL OLs teacher, and now as Richland 1's ML program consultant, where you support and train teachers district-wide. We're so excited to think together with you today.
Yeah, welcome. So to ground us in your lived experience, could each of you just share a bit about your journey with language and how it shaped the way you think about teaching and learning today? And either of you can go first.
No, I mean, I can start. I kind of came into language when I was always been interested in language, but I really came into it in college. My original path in life was going to do linguistics. So in undergrad, I did Spanish and Latin with comparative linguistics as a minor. But after that, I kind of got into education because, 2008 was a bad time to enter the workforce. And that's kind of how I got into that. But language has always been a hobby. So I have proficiency in English, Spanish, Latin, Italian, but I'm always picking up languages like, a collection. I've been working on French most recently. I've done Greek, modern Greek in the past.
Oh, wow. Just total polyglot.
I love
What
that.
about you, Jonathan?
Similar, my experience with really diving into language goes back to college too. I think, as a teacher now, my parents were teachers. I'm a 3rd generation public school teacher. But there was no way I wanted to be that public school teacher when I was in college. But I was really fascinated with the notion of acquiring a language to the level of fluency that I thought was really motivating. And so when I started school, when I went to school, I didn't think that I was going to end up majoring in Russian. But then it also sort of overlaps. The experience also overlapped with just having the best teachers. And I had such good teachers and that were able to make a language sort of turn on in a way where learning was just natural. And honestly, I ended up looking back after 4 years like, oh, I actually have enough credits by just constantly taking these same great teachers' classes to have been a major in another language. But these are people who inspired you to go all over the world to travel and experience other cultures, which is just so fascinating that I don't know. I ended up being inspired to sort of be that teacher myself in a way that I really did not think that I was, I never would have planned on that in the first place. But so language was sort of this just a motivation that, realize it can sort of take you anywhere. It's been a good journey. To me, there was a motivation to want to be able to say like, oh, I want to master something. I want to be able to say that I can learn another language, speak another language. And then by being exposed to people who were good at sort of drawing that out of students, there's another layer, adds another layer of motivation to want to be able to just be in that presence and to experience those things that good teachers are trying to get you to do when you're learning another language. Yeah, if that makes sense, right? So like that, it was very motivating for me. Yeah.
Absolutely. No,
And
yeah,
how
that makes
wonderful to
perfect
get
sense.
to be that person that gets to open those doors for other
Yeah.
people now.
Right. Exactly. And I mean, that's part of the journey. You asked this question about the journey, right? Like, so I graduated with a degree in Russian language and literature, but knowing that I wasn't fluent, that I just didn't feel like I really had, the experience that I needed to be able to say like, no, this is not where I really want to be. And so I moved to Russia with, and then teaching English was the vehicle for being able to do that. And then that was a sort of secondary, awesome experience, was being a teacher myself and being in a room with kids or young adults who, were motivated and had, wanted to be a part of learning English, but actually seeing those light bulbs turn on and being able to sort of like create those awesome connections that teachers have with students. Was that next step. Again, another thing in the journey towards where I did not want to be a teacher, the journey towards actually becoming a teacher. Yeah.
So I similarly did not have any intention of being a teacher. And
Right.
then now I teach teachers, so it's quite ironic. But you really bring up a kind of bring right into the heart of the conversation, which is getting to that point of proficiency. You said you didn't feel like you got to that point in Russian, and so you were able, but then obviously you were proficient in English and were able to turn that light bulb on, help students turn that light bulb on as they were learning English. So in your experience, how does language proficiency actually shape students' ability to participate, to think, to learn? So beyond these test scores, like we test for proficiency, but beyond that, how does proficiency actually change them, help give them the ability to think, participate, and learn?
Yeah, I think if you're
Either
thinking
of
about
you.
it, if you're asking that question from an English perspective, it's really interesting when you have experience with the different types of people who are learning English. And so, I think Paul and I both have experience with teaching English overseas to people who are experiencing English in a foreign language capacity. And maybe it's better to sort of jump to Paul talking about teaching in an immersion environment overseas. But for me, teaching it overseas, it's very different from then coming back to the U.S. and trying to teach in a way where, English is the only way, or the most important, most tangible way that students can access, not just school, but everything that school is supposed to open up for them. And so it's very different from experiencing it in a place where, it is almost like, I mean, you have kids, and I taught kids overseas who wanted to, whose parents were like, you learn English so that you can get a good job. But it wasn't as tangible as when you come back here and there's kids who need English in order to just survive from day to day in
That's
an American
huge. I would
classroom.
love for either or both of you to develop that a little more, because I think, we have global listeners, and I think we would really like to talk about both sides of that coin. So please, either or both of you, comment further on that, because those are both two really important things we'd like to hear more about.
Well, I guess for me, like, language has always been like a skill and a tool for people to use. It's also like that idea of having access to other things. Because you get to see different, having that language, it gives you access to somebody's other culture, their perspective, and just I always come from the point of view when I was teaching, like, you need to have there needs to be a useful purpose for what you're using this language for. What are you going to do with it? Even when I was teaching English, or if I'm teaching Spanish, like, the best part, the most rewarding thing for me as a teacher is when the student would immediately come back and go, I used what we learned the other day in my job or outside of class, and then relating that story and making that connection. And then another thing that I've always been involved with as a teacher is international travel. So like taking kids with me to have those authentic experiences and having them to make those connections. Um, yeah, like John was saying, like language is access, and giving these people access, giving kids access and adults access to through language is a huge. I mean, and one of the most rewarding parts of my job.
And I agree. I think a question I have with that, because I always struggled, especially teaching younger students, when I was teaching younger students whose families wouldn't be able to travel necessarily. How do you bring that ability to see what they're learning beyond the classroom? And how do you do that also teaching abroad, where like beyond the classroom, they're not quite interacting in English after class outside, or just like if you're living in a city teaching Latin or French or Spanish and there aren't native speakers, there isn't a need for it. How do
Yeah.
you create that tangible experience, or how do you help your students really feel the purpose of what they're doing
Now
and excitement around it?
that's a tough question with the less access to the languages. I will say, like with Latin, it's building that interest. You can still make connections to the past. So one of my favorite things to do with my, middle proficiency Latin students is look at graffiti, because it
Mm.
makes like the language of the Romans real. So like these are real people. Butt jokes are universal. It's happened 2,000 years. You can go back and look at an authentic text where this person at this point of time is making a butt joke, you know,
Yeah.
making an insult. So like it's one of those universal things, and teenagers like that. So it's sparks that curiosity, and like that idea of humans are humans across time and space and that sort of thing. Like there's a lot of same cultural connections that still exist. Um,
Yeah. I think
and
that, go ahead.
yeah, pick up,
I was,
man. You got it.
I mean, I was just going to say, like, I think that, like, the way I interpret what you're saying kind of, and maybe this just me trying to sort of fit Paul's statement into my own box, but I think I approach it from looking at language as an art, right? And so the interaction that language has to the arts, and so Paul's talking about, right, like creative application for comedic purposes. I mean, and that's just one example of where I think that art is universal, and it's the kind of thing that we experience for enjoyment, the kind of thing that we experience to have sort of, to have something more than just sort of day-to-day sort of mundane existence, right? And so that's tangible no matter where you are. And so I think, when you look at, even in our district where we have Spanish classrooms for kindergarten, pre-kindergarten through fifth grade, and on these rotations where, there's kids who aren't really being exposed to a volume of language where they're acquiring much, a lot of language or useful applicable language, but they are experiencing they're having an artistic experience, right? And so even in our district, we call them the related arts, and Spanish is a part of a related arts rotation. But I think that's really true when you're looking, when you're teaching English overseas and you have kids who aren't exposed to any any real meaningful English, that they're going to start applying it. And maybe it takes a lot of time before you get to do that, or you're studying it at a college level. And I taught kids, right, who you just want to have fun experiences. You just want to be able to, and that's why I say, like, an artistic experience, right? You want to do something that sort of is either fun or funny or poignant, sort of the what art does for us, right? Like sort of draws out emotion and that kind of thing. I mean, you don't have to have a lot of English or a lot of language or sophisticated language, but it makes it almost immediately tangible. I mean, I think that's Paul's example. That's how I interpret Paul's example, but that's because for me, language, there's a sort of artistry to language that's my approach to sort of making it tangible when you can't,
Well,
when you're limited with how much language you have to use or the experiences that are available to you, if that makes any sense, right?
well, I'd
Well,
like to
that
point
makes
out
complete sense. And go ahead.
well, I want to point out like the
Go
dichotomy
ahead.
there is between like someone my experience of like in abroad versus as a language teacher in the United States, like how dominant like the culture of the United States is when you go abroad. So like so many of the students I interact with when I'm abroad, or people I've interacted with abroad, are so immersed in American culture because of the internet and the pervasiveness of it, and their English is their access to this, um,
Yeah.
this to this culture thing that's dominant everywhere. Like one of the things that struck me the most when I traveled to Spain the first time is the first thing I saw was The Simpsons. Like right out of the airport, there's The Simpsons right there. But then when you interact with kids, like they're wanting to consume American culture, they're seeing it all the time. And then that was in, the early 2000s. And now with how pervasive the internet, like how much more that is, like with social media and that sort of thing, and how, people in other countries experience America, like it's kind of a big deal. One like anecdote I like to bring up is when I was teaching in Spain, all my students knew I was from South Carolina. They knew vaguely about the South Carolina Gamecocks. And a famous incident happened at a football game where a ref tackled a player. And the very next day in class, my students were brought it up. They're like, Mr. Spence, did you see this? And they had seen it on the internet, and it made that connection because they were that connected to it and were
Oh my
paying attention to the
gosh.
internet, and they knew about it in English and were talking to me about it. And it was like one of those, I don't know, weird or small world moments
I
where these
can't
kids in
imagine what
Spain
that's
who
like
could care
now. I
less about
cannot
American
imagine.
football, much less South Carolina, had experienced it and made that connection in language and was able to talk to me about it.
You're right. Like
Yeah,
with
well,
social media, it's all the more, even with
Right.
gaming, like kids are talking on video games with people from all over the world at all times.
Well, and I've had plenty of my high school students here in the United States. They want to learn the language because they want to access some sort of media that they've experienced. Like the common one I see is they're trying to teach themselves Japanese because they want to read or watch the anime in the language. So I see that often here, especially with Japanese.
Language proficiency isn't a single moment, it's a journey.
At Avant, we support the entire proficiency cycle, from learning to assessing real-world language use to certifying skills that open doors beyond the classroom. Our connected platform gives educators clear data, less guesswork, and meaningful ways to recognize what learners can truly do with language.
If you're looking for a better way to support growth, from first practice to verified proficiency, visit avantlanguage.com.
Avant, the language proficiency company. Well, you guys have actually just led directly into my next question, which has to do with multiliteracies in practice. So, when we move from ideas into the classroom itself, we're in this show, we're trying to explore the idea of multiliteracies, which is language in its multiple modes. So we've mentioned many of them already. You've talked about art. You talked about the digital literacies, gaming. We didn't talk about music, but it could be music. It could be, just any mode in which you can come across language, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what does that look like in real classrooms or programs? As I'm sure we have teachers listening, and not just theorists and not just, people that work in the district office. So what is that when you go into classrooms, when you see teachers maybe using these multiple modes, these multiliteracies to get kids excited? What are some things that you see or that you think they could be doing?
Yeah, one of the coolest things I've seen most recently in an AP classroom is using short form video as a way to interact with language, because so much of the media that, Gen Z, Gen Alpha interact with is short form video. So part of this AP assignment was to talk about a topic and about your choice of topic and do it in a short form social media video style. And Jonathan watched a few of them too, and just watching these kids talk off the cuff like you're talking to the camera, like you see on TikTok or Instagram Reels, and producing something that's engaging but using the language for that purpose was really fun. Like my favorite one was this student impersonated his teacher and did it with the inflection and the tone. Spanish isn't his first language, but he is a heritage speaker, so he grew up around it, and it was him excited to use it. The kids loved it, and it was probably one of the funniest and most well-done projects I've seen in a while.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, I think the short form video is really, really interesting sort of phenomenon of like modern culture, and it not being in the classroom, sort of being in that, you mentioned that training teachers, mode, but that's definitely something that's really inspiring. And those videos were pretty cool to watch. I would love to see more and more of that type of thing in classrooms. just because technology allows you to do more, especially with listening and speaking and I mean, making students more comfortable. I mean, they're comfortable, right? So they're used to the, presumably, like, that's part of culture anywhere, and just being able to infuse language into those things is really interesting way to take that, your question about literacies, right? Like I'm used to literacy from, and Liza, like from an ESOL classroom perspective, you're used to literacy, especially lower grade levels. You're just like, can we get students to learn how to read, but it is interesting to think that, I mean, I have to think a little bit more about how that interacts, how that looks in a U.S. based public school classroom when you have students who are learning English as a second language.
The
But
other
for
thing
sure, go ahead.
well, Jonathan, I think I've seen not in just ESOL, just world languages, but I've seen with ESOL is teachers utilizing, like um, graphic novels and everything, because so many kids
Yeah.
love like Diary of the Wimpy Kid and engaging with language in that way, where you're working with creating your own graphic novels and that sort of thing for presentational language.
Mhm.
I've seen some French teachers doing that. Like, here's a graphic novel we created talking about some sort of simple story, even novice level learners being able to engage in it in that way.
There is that kind of that point of, I remember when I was a teacher, I had a TikTok account, never post on it, but would download reels about whatever topic
Yeah.
I was teaching about,
Mhm.
or Instagram. My students were instantly more intrigued when it's a reel. It's a familiar format. Same with graphic novels. That's also that short form. It's a mode where they're not overwhelmed by text, especially a novice learner. And it's exciting because it's also what they're doing on their own and choosing to do for that novelty of the language.
Yeah, my
So,
favorite thing to do as a Latin teacher
yeah.
was memes. So, like, students are in
Oh,
the
yeah.
internet all the time, and memes are become a new facet of language. And like, you talk about
Mhm.
art and that sort of thing, it's an art in itself. So, like, I routinely, my students would create memes as their check for understanding for something.
Yeah.
We did use Cambridge Latin for our text and for our curriculum, and the memes that my students would produce about Grumio, one of the characters, my Latin teachers out here know what I'm talking about, were were hilarious. And the kids would connect and were constantly wanting to share their new meme about what they created about the characters in this text. And Spanish to a certain extent too. Like, some days we would start, like, the bell work would be, I'd have a meme up there about, and it'd be related to something we learned grammar wise, and kids laughing when they get the meme because they understand the context and what the language is, and being
Yeah,
able to learn
yeah.
something authentic. WhatsApp's great about finding Spanish memes because those get
Mhm.
passed around the internet also.
Yeah, those are perfect examples of that idea of multiliteracy, is that we can use
Yeah.
language in multiple modes to make meaning out of text. And I was thinking too, I don't know if you remember way back to our ESOL teacher prep cohort days, Jonathan, but just the simple idea of creating text sets for teachers to provide a different entry point for students
Yeah.
around a topic. So, and inside the text set, there could be an infographic on that topic. There could be a picture book on that topic. There could be a more challenging picture book, a less challenging picture book, a longer text type article. There could be multiple different types of text all around the same topic that provides a different entry point for all of the different learners. That's an example, not a new example, but an example of multiliteracies in the classroom that we talked about for ESL
Yeah.
students, our multilingual learners.
Well, and I mean, I think your example kind of connects with listening to Paul talk, where I would take my impression of multiliteracies in classrooms when you're looking at secondary, especially secondary ESOL classrooms, is the cultural competency literacies within cultures, right? And so
Yeah.
you take as an example, right? So your looking at text set. And so I remember, we've had discussions that go way back about text sets where you're trying to choose texts that connect to, that sort of open or connects to cultures for students, right? And so there's a way that at least that's my impression of a lot of those activities that you allude to, this where you're choosing text for students, but you're doing so in a way that allows them to connect, what we might see in a normal class, in a standard US classroom, right? You're reading novels, right? So let's say we're going to read a novel, but then you're connecting it to their own culture and who they are. And so there's a certain, this is where I would take this question, right? There's a certain literacy in terms of being able to navigate your culture and the dominant culture, the culture of schooling. And that's as I listen to the conversation, I'm thinking, one of the things that was important to me as a teacher, especially but this was before when not everybody had cell phones, and it was, cell phones were a sign of status, and we weren't looking at memes very often, but it was really important to tell your own story. And it was really important to be able to navigate, why are we in school? What is school going to do for me? And then, so to me, that is this, and maybe it's just a sign of me being a little bit out of touch with modern classrooms that do have access to TikTok. But, to me, it's the answer is more storytelling oriented, is more trying to figure out ways to get students to be able to think about who they are and then what school is, and then who they are in school and why school is important for them, or why it's not, right? I mean, one of the things I used to love was having real critical conversations with students about, whether we should be challenging our notion of what's happening in school, or what's the purpose of this. And teenagers, right? You teach teenagers in a high school, and they're constantly thinking about how, this is not for me. This is not what I want. And so that then opens the door to some, what I would say at maybe at a base level, looks like storytelling, looks like being able to engage with, people in your life, people in your family, adults around you, to understand more about life. But then, at a higher level, it is just sort of a cultural literacy, to be able to navigate schooling, right? To be able to say oh, this is, because to me, it's motivating, right? So there's a connection to motivation. If students are, you're as an ESOL teacher in a public school, you're helping people, you have students who are tangibly interested in passing their English class, right? But then a lot of those students, especially the longer they've been here, they start to see that sometimes systems aren't built for them. Sometimes, it just feels like you're on the outside. And as a teacher, trying to get those students to not just feel like they're on the inside, but, you just want them to graduate too. You want them to be able to jump through all of the, whatever these hoops are. You have to have, I don't know, you find yourself asking questions and sort of developing a cultural literacy within schools that it's kind of a serious thing, but it is also a really, really fun thing. It's a real motivating thing. And I think, that's one of the things I enjoyed about teaching, especially teaching teenagers in those really hard situations. You're in a school, you don't understand half of what's going on, but one of the first things you want to be able to do, or at least was really motivating, was to be let's talk about why you're here and what you want out of this thing, and why people built this school in the first place and what it's supposed to do for you.
I love that you brought that up, because I was actually in a training yesterday and a teacher was asking, how do you deal with those kids that are just trying to get the credit, that they don't want to be there? And
which is all of them.
Language teaching is such a powerful vehicle, especially when you bring in multiliteracy. You're not having to teach a specific set of something. You can apply it to anything in life, and you can really bring that student and their interests into it. So I love that you spoke to that. And I guess I have a follow-up question of, what do you do to kind of bring in, you talked about bringing those students in, letting them see themselves in what they're learning and engage and be excited about it. How do you start in order to be able to do that? Kind of someone listening that wants to, where do you begin, and how do you achieve that, where you get them engaged and passionate and caring about it when they're just in compliance mode.
Yeah. Voice and choice is a huge part of it.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
students have to understand why they're doing it, and they're going to have to see themselves in it. So like when I started about memes and short form video, I mean Gen Z, Gen Alpha, that's how they interact. That's what they're interested in. Like if you have to fight for their attention for TikTok, so you need
Yeah.
to be that to make that happen for them. I mean, for most kids, Latin is like, why this is a dead language. What am I doing in here besides a credit? But like, if you can find those interesting, those hooks, you can let them
Right.
see themselves in it. Like that helps. Same thing
Totally
with like
agree.
teaching English. English,
Yeah.
for my experience of teaching English, it's a lot different because a lot of those kids see the purpose. It's their access to being to their community where they're living now, or if you're teaching them abroad, it's their access to the greater world, that better job. Like I need English to, for money. So yeah, Jonathan, what do you want to add to
Yeah, I
that?
mean, I think that's exactly right. Like it's this, and not just choice and voice from the perspective of like letting them talk and letting them sort of define their interests, but you have to know who they are. You have to know their interests. You have to start with questions, and you have to start with observations of, okay, this is, and it's just like this idea with using TikTok in the classroom, right? Like, is this going to get them to come in and say, oh, I'm interested in that, I want to talk about that? That's, so you have to think like, what, just watching students, listening to them on a daily basis, like what do they want? What might, maybe spark their curiosity, but I think what's really, really cool about looking at culture and looking at these, looking at, the struggle that especially like a student who has low proficiency in a school where they have all of these high proficiency expectations, is to be controversial and to just to lean into the fact that, like, sometimes things suck, and you can talk about why things suck, or you can talk about like why it feels like the principal doesn't like you. And you're finally listening to, like, you have teachers who are willing to like, sure, go ahead, voice your opinion on, why, I don't know, not to get too political, but like why certain systems just don't seem fair. Right. And then you just gotta, you've got, so listen and watch, so that then it's almost like you're not really asking them what they prefer to do, but you're sort of figuring out what they prefer to do. For me, that was always, I mean, I think a tangible way to sort of answer that question is just to say, like, look, we're writing journals where you have multiple things that you have options to write about. This was when we didn't have access to technology as much, but I could easily see it as, show me what's on your phone, or show me the last thing that you were interested in. I definitely have had really good experiences, even with kids as young as, third grade, where, it's like, all right, when you go home from school, what are you going to watch on television tonight? Right. And then they tell you those things, and then you just start to figure out, like, well, how is that, how is, like Paul mentioned, some anime, right? Like, how is that interesting, and how can we tie that into bigger conversations? And it's almost like Liza said, like it's a text, right? You're just bringing in these texts, but because I mean, there's text in everybody's life, right? So I don't know, maybe that's an easier answer. Just find the texts that they're already exposed to and bring them into your class, right?
Preach. I mean,
Yeah.
I am loving everything that you're saying. I mean, absolutely. I wrote down cultural literacy, because my goodness, what do we need more right now than teachers who are studying the cultural literacy of their students in their classrooms and looking
Right.
at each child as a text? Oh my goodness, I just got chills when you when you said that. I thought, wow, if every teacher in every classroom were looking at their child as a text, the culture that they bring into the classroom, and then we're
Right.
incorporating that text into the grand body of knowledge that we should all be learning. Oh my
Right.
goodness. How
Right. I mean,
rich.
and because in only way like that, those create, there's language skills that are necessary, right? So you have to, and Paul and I were talking about something earlier where the more sophisticated your language ends up having to be, right? So in order to really articulate your story, in order to really connect yourself to those, connect these texts that are important to you, you need language, and you need, I mean, I was an English language arts teacher, right? So you need just those basic, like, you need to learn how to write complete sentences and how to edit and revise and say what you mean or make an argument, address a counterclaim. I mean, all of those things, all of the things that are important to, I mean, our public school standards here in the U.S., like, and I imagine anywhere else, like, and those, I mean, those end up being the standards that you need. Those are the hoops you have to jump through in order to graduate too.
Yeah.
But it's all of it.
Yeah.
All of those things are necessary in order to just participate in. I mean, and it's just stuff they always do. We're all a part of it, right? You go home. Kids are going to go home and watch My Hero Academia anyway. Like, might as well make it part of a conversation.
Absolutely. Well, as we zoom out a little bit, looking ahead, so we've talked a lot about the past and the present. Where do you see language education heading? I mean, I know we've got AI. I know we've got, we try not to delve too much into politics, but obviously that's, there's, lots of things happening. So where do we see language education heading? And more particularly, what gives you hope about language education for the future?
Well, Jonathan and I had a really good conversation about AI and language models at lunch. But I think right now is a really tough spot for language education just because of you have this double whammy of current policies that don't believe in language education, and then the second whammy of AI can just fix it. Does that make sense? So you have to fight why a human perspective is important and why this is important for humans to have when you have that double whammy. Large language models are just predictive engines. Like, you show them like how something looks, they see a pattern and they try to reproduce that pattern. There's no real thought going into it. That's why it works well for translation, because if it's matching those patterns, but it's not going to work well for, if you don't know what you're looking for. Does that make sense? I routinely use a large language model to help me with what I'm doing, but I'm also bilingual and biliterate, and I know when it's producing crap.
That's the key. The key is what you just said, right? So that value that you bring as a bilingual, biliterate person, multiliterate people bring to interacting with large language models, because ultimately the usefulness of those models, at least right now, and until they start prompting themselves, right? We have to prompt them. And it is, anybody who's ever played with any of these models recognizes that the way I ask the question it dictates the answer that I'm going to get. And so the usefulness of AI is only as useful as your ability to ask a question the right way. And that inherently is language. And that inherently is, multilingual people are going to be better at asking questions, at prompting large language models. Right now, I mean, that, to me, that's huge. And I think that's exactly Paul's example. Like, he's a great user of it. But there's lots of folks probably who, it's like, write my lesson plan for me. And you're not going to get a great lesson plan by just asking ChatGPT to write a lesson plan, right?
Right. You've got to also know, and that's part of that digital literacy and literacy in general, of when are you being given a source that's legitimate and good to use, and when are you not? And that is part of also what you're teaching students is, when are you reading something that's not true? When are you finding a AI response that's not helpful and you need to change your prompt versus use what you got?
No, as I've used large language models, I find they can lead me down the wrong path very quickly.
Yep.
And so, it's, as you both said, how much you know about the topic that you're trying to get help with is actually pretty important. And so while they do, I feel like it's interesting because I heard both of you talk about language as access.
Right.
And so when I think about a large language model in the hands of the general public, that's an insane amount of access. I mean, an insane amount of access. And so that's, to me, wow, incredibly hopeful,
Yeah.
but also a little terrifying
Yeah.
if it's not being used with some expertise, right? Because it's kind of like you said,
Isn't
if you
that the
don't
way it is
have-
with all media though right now? I mean, we've been living the last, like media has been that way for 10 years now. We have people who have access to media and they don't know how to consume media. So in a way, to me, it's a similar thing. And it maybe so you kind of scare me now too, because if this is if we're living in the world if what they've done with their their poor access of media, what are they going to do with poor access of large language models, which can tell you whatever you want them to tell you? Way better than media being able to go to the website of the news source that tells you whatever you want it to tell you, right? Like,
well, I don't mean to be terrifying. I mean, I genuinely do believe that access, I agree with you in that access to language is important and powerful. And I think that as these tools are developed, and if they're developed well, and if they're developed by people who really care, and if they're developed by ethical people who have, values and put in guardrails that are good for the public, then they could provide some incredible access. I think so that does give me hope, but I also, that's a big if, so I think it's important that we have these conversations and that we are, you guys are decision makers in your district. You are influencers. And so to me, that we have these conversations and that we have them in our schools and with our teachers. And, to me, that's really important because it's here, it's happening. It is the future and it's exciting, but let's do it right,
Well, and it's exciting for language teachers.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Too many teachers are on the other end. We need to block it. I mean, the cat's already out of the bag. Like now we have to adjust and learn how to live with it and teach kids how to use it appropriately.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, it's really promising for language advocacy, right? Like, so we're here able to say, like, look, in order to use this and use it in a way that's not scary and use it in a way that's ethical, you have to be good with language. You have to be able to navigate language. I mean, you have to know how to ask the right kind of questions and you have to know how to recognize what you're getting back what you're getting back. And that's what Paul and I have talked a lot about, is what you're getting back is a hallucination or is it's just junk. Or it's not useful, right? And it's like watching old student presentations where it's like, oh, I have to, you give the student an assignment and they have to build a PowerPoint and they put a picture of like Hello Kitty on their PowerPoint. And it's like that image is not applicable to you talking about, famine or something. And like, so those are skills, but those are all still those skills that are like really relevant to what we do as language teachers. I think that's pretty promising to think that you're, if there are people like Paul in leadership positions advocating, like, no, we need these skills. Like, these are the skills of the future.
Yeah. Absolutely.
There is one point I want to go back to, and we're talking about the socio-political context of the world right now. We're like in a titanic shift, not only with the technology, but with how America's moving to be a bit more isolationist. And it's going to take people now. People are going to come to Americans with English to connect with us. We're going to, in the future, I see it definitely now. The power shift has moved a little bit. It's going to take people who have language skills going to other countries to meet them in the middle. Because for too long it's been you learn English. That's how you come and play on America's playground. But now, just in the last year, it's moving more towards, it's looking like you're going to need to have language skills and meet other countries on their level, and we're going to need people with that cultural context and language skills to rebuild those relationships.
Very interesting. Well, thank you guys both so much. You have shared so much good information and wise knowledge. We're close to our time, so to close us out, What's just one idea or final thought you'd love for listeners to carry with them from this conversation?
Well, I would say have fun. I mean, like if language classes should be fun and should be a joyous place. So make it fun and make it joyful.
Love that.
Yeah,
What
and
about you,
I'll just tag
Jonathan?
on. Totally agree with that, but make it meaningful too, right? Like we, there's so much that we're all. If you're in a situation where you're teaching young people, they're growing up in a world that needs critical thinkers and people who are doing something meaningful with the language that they have, or even with anything that they study. And so have fun for sure, but do something meaningful.
I love it.
Yeah, thank you both so much for joining us for the inspiring conversation and the energy you bring, and also the work you're doing for your teachers and students every single day in your district.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank
that
you.
was
And
fun.
to wrap up for our viewers, if you are listening and you were intrigued by something in this episode and you want to add to the conversation, comment below and remember to like, subscribe, and share this podcast in your networks. Until next time. All opinions expressed in this podcast and the comments are solely those of the individual and not necessarily those of Avant.